Next, we'd like to start Part 1, the evolution of corporate reporting, GRI's role in making impact reporting a mainstream global practice, and Part 2, GRI's standard setting agenda and capacity building activities. The speakers are GSSB Chair Ms. Carol Adams, GSSB members Mr. Tomo Machiba, and GRI Chief Standard Officer Mr. Bastian Bach. The chair, Ms. Carol Adams, is an internationally renowned researcher in the field of sustainability accounting and reporting, and she has been the chair of GSSB since 2023. Mr. Tomo Machiba is a former reporter of Asahi newspaper and has been involved in supporting corporate and government sustainability strategy response internationally. He is a board member of GSSB since January 2024. Mr. Bastian Bach has worked at GRI since 2006 and is responsible for the ongoing development, implementation, and enhancement of GRI's sustainability reporting standards and working with other standard-setting bodies. Now, over to you.
It is really a great pleasure for us to be here in Tokyo today talking with you, and thank you very much for coming to listen to us and hear what we have to say. We're very grateful to the SSBJ for organizing this event and a schedule of meetings for us today and tomorrow. And we are particularly grateful because they have real leadership in standard setting and a real interest in making sure that corporate reporting makes sense for corporate reporters and for the users of corporate reports. And we're looking forward to collaborating with them further. I'm now going to pass on to Tomu to talk some more about GRI, and I'll be back shortly.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm serving as the board member of GSSB. Since January, I've been in this position. I'm Tomo Machiba. Thank you very much for having me today. Well, I have had long relationships with GRI since 2004 to 2004, when GRI established the first office in Amsterdam. I was a part of the secretariat, and I was involved in setting guidelines and sector supplement and boundary protocols. I helped this process between 2002 and 2004. Back then, they had the stakeholder process. We brought corporations and auditors, experts, NGO, labor organizations, the stakeholders. They brought these stakeholders on board, and we had a heated discussion in a room for us to come up with a set of guidelines. So that's where I was involved. It was a unique initiative. It was a new initiatives back then. At the moment, it has become a norm for everybody to have a discussion with stakeholders, and I think this is also true for corporation. But back then, it was quite a new initiatives back then. So the evolution of sustainability reporting, and why is it that we now have SSBJ in Japan? So I would like to give you a brief historical background before I give the floor to the two guest speakers to discuss in more detail the GRI standards. So who are we? GRI is an independent international organization providing the global common language for corporate transparency. GRI focuses on helping businesses and other organizations to understand and communicate their sustainability impacts, both negative and positive. That's our focus. And what sets GRI apart is that GRI has been adopted globally, but we believe that GRI standards are a public good, and we freely make available GRI standards as a public good. And GRI is a not-for-profit organization, and that is another element that makes GRI unique. This is our footprint. Our global headquarters is in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, since 2002. But in addition to our global headquarters, we have regional hubs. In Asia, we have a regional hub in Hong Kong and Singapore. We also have local presence in different regions around the world to promote GRI, to represent GRI and to promote GRI. In Japan, we have a sustainability forum, but that used to be GRI Forum Japan. And that has been used as a vehicle to promote GRI in Japan. And this has been active since 2003 in Japan. This shows the timeline or the history of GRI, and I'm a part of this history, which I'm very proud of. In Boston, back in 1997, Ceres, asking responsibility for businesses. That was an NGO series. Non-financial reporting should be generalized on par with financial reporting. That was an idea which they came up with, and it has been a history of implementing that. So we are celebrating the 27th anniversary this year. So that's the history, ESG, CSR history that this history has also been. And in 2000, the first version of guideline was launched. In 2002, in Amsterdam, a headquarters was established. Why not in the United States? Having a headquarters in the United States, I mean, you're all aware of the discussions that are taking place at the SEC. You have to be global, and you have to be recognized as global in order for GRI to be recognized as global. They thought that we should have a headquarters in Europe, and that is why we established a headquarters in Amsterdam in 2002. The G3, and back in 2003, G4, GRI G4 was launched, and back in 2016, we changed from guideline to standard. The nomenclatures changed from guideline to standard, so that our standards will have governance in place, just like the ISO and other standards around the world. This shows GRI's history in Japan. I put together this. In the early part of 1990s, environmental reporting started in Japan. According to my recollection, in 1992, TEPCO issued its environmental report. That, I believe, was the first environmental report. And this expanded to triple bottom line, environment, social, economy, as the bottom line. The three bottom lines, triple bottom lines. And in addition to environmental report, the sustainability report, the GRI guideline was launched. And GRI has evolved over the years, and in Europe, in response to the GRI evolution, a disclosure, for all listed companies, the same disclosure should be in place. France was the first to require all the businesses to adopt sustainability reporting, NFRD, all the way to CSRD, and not just sustainability disclosure, but adding due diligence. We now have CSDDD in Europe. So it has broadened its scope. Civil organizations, consumers, civic organizations used to have strong interest in this initiative. But over the years, investors have become increasingly interested, ESG investment being a part of that. And securities exchanges have taken the initiative to require sustainability disclosure in different parts of the world. After that, integrated reporting framework, SASB, IIRC, SASB standards based on IFRS integration did take place. Meanwhile, NGOs have also been active in this space on specific topics, GHG's protocol, CDP, more recently SBT, have emerged. All these have been affected by GRI, and GRI have had feedback from these different initiatives. And this has been a whole evolutionary procedure. In Japan, Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry issued guidelines, and they have all referenced the GRI over the years. Ultimately, SSBJ emerged after the revision of corporate governance. This gives you a glimpse of the impact of GRI. 78% of the world's largest 250 companies reporting on sustainability use a GRI. It's difficult to grasp who are actually using GRI, but according to the GRI Secretariat, there are 14,000 organizations that publish a GRI report each year. When I was at the Secretariat, we could actually count manually, but no longer we can count manually because the organizations publishing GRI report each year is so large. And we have a GRI community. More than 500 organizations from 85 countries are members of the GRI community, and members of the GRI community are supporting the GRI activities. These could be business organizations or non-business organizations. In 102 countries, either governments, policy or security exchanges requirements, they either reference GRI or require GRI in a large number of countries. In Japan, the first version of environmental reporting guideline was issued in 2000, and a government document referred to GRI guideline. And JPX in 2000 published 2020 published ESG Information Disclosure Practice Handbook. This also references GRI, and the SSBJ's exposure draft issued in March 2024 includes reference to GRI alongside with ESRS standards which SSBJ reporters could refer to. As did the map show, in Taiwan, Egypt, and Zimbabwe, in these three countries, the use of GRI standard is required for listed companies. GRI standards could be used almost mandatory. Mandatory reporting policies that state GRI standards can be used for compliance. There are almost 10 countries. ESRS in EU, India, and China are jurisdictions where mandatory reporting requirements are aligned with GRI standards. More than 40 stock exchanges refer or require GRI. Tokyo is not on this slide, but Tokyo is one of these exchanges. This shows percentage of public companies with revenues over $250 million using each reporting framework. GRI is number one, only next to SDGs. And the world references GRI. In the world, GRI is the most frequently referenced, as you can see.
And for those using GRI and your company's performance relationship, there is a World Benchmark Alliance scores and GRI Content Index is used by 47, and these companies that use the index, at least their score is 47% higher than their counterparts. And companies using GRI standards in terms of assuring the quality, that is one reason. And also based on GRI, companies conducting assurance compared to other frameworks, this percentage is much higher. So far, this was my presentation. And next, Bastien? Carol? Yes, Carol is going to continue with the presentation. Thank you very much.
Hello again. You might want to use your earpiece because I can't speak Japanese. But I want to talk to you first of all about the approach that we use at GRI in our standards development. Our standards are truly global, so all of our governance bodies, and particularly the GSSB, has representation from all parts of the world. And each of our project working groups and our technical expert committees that are involved in developing each of our standards also have representation from all over the world. So for each standard that we develop, we bring together experts on that particular topic at a global level. We also involve the full range of stakeholders that are relevant to a particular topic. So we recognize these stakeholder constituencies throughout the world. How do I put this on the Japanese? It's moved to the English version. No, I want it on the Japanese version so people can read it. Thank you. So we want to make sure that each of the stakeholder groups are represented in all of our standards development work as well. So we have representations from civil society that might include academics, from business enterprises, investment institutions, labor organizations, and what we call mediating institutions, and mostly those are consultants working in the field of sustainability reporting, advising clients in sustainability reporting. So our standards board and our project working groups and technical expert committees are all volunteers working within the fields that they represent. So they have a high level of up-to-date knowledge and experience in their particular line of work, as you'll have gathered from my colleague, Tomu. No? Okay, thank you. Now, these are our standards here. This is our system of standards. So we have 3 universal standards, which they're the green ones here. So GRI 1 requires organizations, it sets out the principles that organizations are required to use in their reporting. Now, those of you from an accounting background will recognize these principles because they're very much aligned to those used in financial reporting. GRI 2 contains general disclosures that organizations should disclose around themselves, so the nature of their business, for example. And GRI 3 is probably my favorite standard. That sets out guidance for how organizations go about determining their most significant impacts. And I'll come back to that one in a moment. And then we have a suite of sector standards. So these standards identify the most significant impacts of organizations in a particular sector. And we've started off developing those for the most impactful sectors, and Bastian will speak to this a bit more later on. So they identify the most significant impacts for companies in the sector, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals that are most relevant to that sector, and they also include the topic disclosures that are most relevant to that particular sector. And then we have the topic standards. So these cover specific issues like labor rights, human rights, pollution, biodiversity, climate change, and so on. Now, GRI 1 also contains these concepts. Now, these are not like the concepts in financial reporting. The principles overlap with those in financial reporting, but these concepts are quite different. So impact is the effect that an organization has or could have on the economy, the environment, or people, including on their human rights, as a result of activities of the business and its relationships. We don't refer to impact materiality in the standards, but we do use the term material topics. And these are the topics that represent the organization's most significant impacts on the economy, environment, and people. Due diligence refers to the process of identifying, preventing, mitigating, and accounting for how the organization addresses its actual and potential negative impacts. Now, we believe this is really important in terms of encouraging organizations to change. So not only are we asking organizations to report on their impacts, we're asking them to report on how they manage those impacts, what plans they have to try to reduce any negative impacts, and at what level there is oversight in the organization of those activities. And a stakeholder, as I've described, is an individual or group that has an interest or is affected by the organization's activities. So that might be its employees, it might be potential future employees, it might be the local communities around where the organization is operating, its suppliers, its customers, its investors. And NGOs as well. So GRI 3, my favorite GRI standard, sets out how organizations should determine their material topics and their most significant impacts. And I'm going to spend a bit of time on this because this is a stepping stone for identifying the risks and opportunities for the organization. So the first step in identifying an organization's most significant impacts is understanding the context in which the organization operates. Now, some of that might be geographic, that might lend to the organization having particular impacts in a particular region or country. Some of it is going to be due to the sector that the organization operates in. And the GRI sector standards, as I've said, help guide organizations in identifying their most significant impacts. So we do some of that work for you through the sector standards. The second and third steps involve identifying the actual and potential impacts of the organization and assessing the significance of those impacts. Now, that involves engaging with a range of stakeholders. If you're not engaging with your stakeholders, then you don't really have a full understanding of your impacts on those stakeholders. So this is a really important part of the exercise. And through that engagement, you also get to know what the risks are to your organizations, because you're getting the stakeholder view of your organizations, and that might give insights into risks for your organization. It might also involve engaging with scientists and experts in a particular field or industry or an industry body, and so on. And from that process of identifying and assessing those significant impacts, you can then start working to prioritize those impacts on which you are going to report. Now, assessing the significance of a potential negative impacts is determined by the severity and the likelihood of the impact occurring. Now, the severity to us has three elements: scale, scope, and irremediable character. So the scale of an impact might be, for example, if you have a large chemical company that is polluting, how serious is that pollution? Is it going to kill people? Is it going to make them sick, for example? The scope would be around how widespread is the damage that's caused by that impact. Does it affect a whole region, or is it limited to a small community? And the irremediable character is about how hard it is to counteract or make good that harm that is being done. So there is overlap between those three elements, and together they give us an idea of the severity of the impact. The likelihood of the potential negative impact refers to the chance of that impact occurring. And that might be measured in a qualitative way or a quantitative way. Now, that whole process then helps you identify the risks that arise from those most significant impacts. So again, we're not using the term impact materiality, because that can depend on which stakeholder group we're talking about. Different impacts affect different stakeholders, but we identify the most significant impacts through this process. And we believe, as the GSSB, the Global Sustainability Standards Board, we believe they almost always present risks for the organization and also opportunities which are financially material. And many consultants around the world are advising their clients to start the process of identifying risks by identifying the most significant impacts by talking to stakeholders. And indeed, that is the approach that's advised through the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. Now, why does this matter to investors? Of course, it matters to a full range of stakeholders, but why does this process of identifying the most significant impacts matter to investors? So they are key audiences, and along with regulators and stock exchanges, they are key audiences for sustainability reporting. And they are increasingly concerned about investing responsibly. For example, if you look at pension funds and superannuation funds, they invest over the long term. And employees that are paying into pension funds are increasingly concerned about what their funds are putting the money in. And they are wanting them to invest in companies and in initiatives that are socially and environmentally responsible. Investors also take an interest in the impacts reported under GRI standards, and we have investors on our Global Sustainability Standards Board who know this and think like this, because they want to make their own assessment of the risks and opportunities that these impacts create for companies. They don't necessarily trust companies to know what the risks are that are imposed by the impacts that they're reporting. And if they do know what they are, how do they know they're going to disclose them? So they want to see the impact reported so they can make their own assessment of the risks that might arise from those impacts. We also believe as a GSSB that these most significant impacts over the long term do affect investor returns. And many investors now have a specific purpose for being concerned around impacts. So a number of stock exchanges around the world and regulators, as Tomu mentioned earlier, reference or require GRI standards to be listed on their stock exchanges for this reason. And if I could go on to just give you the GSSB view on this relationship between impacts and risks and opportunities a bit more. Again, we believe that most, if not all, of the impacts of an organization will eventually translate to risks and opportunities. The impacts of the organization can affect the availability and quality and affordability of the resources that the organization depends on. So this is the word dependency. And they also affect the relationships that the organization depends on. Now, those dependencies themselves, which are influenced by impacts, create risks and opportunities for the organization. The risks and opportunities can affect the organization's business model or strategy, and consequently its cash flows and so on. So understanding the impacts is a necessary first step to identifying the risks and opportunities that result in an organization's that result from an organization's impacts. And one of the things we're hoping to collaborate with the SSBJ on and others is our own guidance on this process of expanding GRI 3 to look at how that then helps reporting risks and opportunities under the IFRS S standards and the SSBJ standards. And coming on to our Biodiversity 101 standard, which we have recently revised and launched at the beginning of this year, we did this because there is an unprecedented rate of biodiversity loss, and that's connected with climate change. Biodiversity features very strongly in the UN SDGs and the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And there's been a growing call for increased transparency over the impact that organizations have on biodiversity loss. And also a recognition that this impact affects the resources that companies need, the natural resources that are available to companies to conduct their business and through their business model. And we wanted to align with updated global best practice. So this gives you an idea of how long it takes to develop a standard. The standards division under Bastian's leadership started working on this project in 2021, early in 2021. The standard wasn't released until early this year. So we're now in a transition period when organizations may be using the old standard or the new standard. By the beginning of 2026, they'll have to use the new standard. And in order to develop this standard, we had a technical committee. And so just to give you an idea of this multi-stakeholder approach to developing our technical committees, these are how they were split up. We had 4 members from business reporting organizations, many of them big global organizations with a global footprint. We had 5 members from civil society organizations concerned with different aspects of biodiversity and nature. 2 members from investment institutions, including the World Bank. We had 1 member from Labour and 6 members from what we call mediating institutions, so academics, the CDP, and other organizations, some particularly concerned with biodiversity. And nature. Sorry, I hadn't put that on the Japanese translation there. There it is. I'll leave that there for a moment. So that's an example of the multi-stakeholder and global nature of our technical expert group. And the people who come from these organizations to be on these technical expert groups are senior, experienced people. We are very fortunate to be able to attract the very best experts to help us developing our standards in a voluntary basis, because they believe in what we are doing. So looking now at the biodiversity disclosure landscape, of course, a lot of organizations involved in this now. So we have the intergovernmental instruments, the Convention of Biological Diversity, international frameworks and initiatives. So the TNFD is there. And the team under Bastian's leadership worked very closely with the TNFD through the process of developing the impact disclosures on these standards. So our biodiversity standard includes more impact disclosures than the TNFD, but where they do overlap, they're very similar because of the collaboration that happened throughout that development. Where there are slight differences, we have a document which says where those differences are. Also, there is the Science-Based Targets Network, which influenced the development of our standard. EFRAG, the European Sustainability Reporting Standard E4, looks at biodiversity and ecosystems. The IFRS and the Foundation through the ISSB are now planning to develop a biodiversity standard, and I think they're looking at starting that work mid-next year. And we have agreed with them through an MOU that we will collaborate with them on that effort. Of course, they will be focused on the disclosures on risks and opportunities using the TNFD as a basis for those disclosures, whilst our standard is focused on the impacts of an organization on biodiversity. And this here is an outline of the disclosures in our biodiversity standard. So it covers how the organization determines which sites and which products and services in the supply chain have the most significant impacts on biodiversity, the location of the sites, products and services with the most significant impacts, and then how the activities of the organization and its products and services drive biodiversity impacts. So that is required to be disclosed. And then we also have a disclosure looking at, well, what are those impacts? How do those impacts affect the state of biodiversity? So what actual damage, if you like, is the organization doing, and what is it doing to rectify that damage? Now, we also ask organizations to disclose their policies and commitments to biodiversity. So this is one aspect of how GRI reporting encourages and guides companies to do better. Another really key disclosure is asking organizations to disclose what they are doing to address those impacts. And that's, again, encouraging organizations to change what they do so that they can do better. So in terms of rolling out the standard, as I said, we have a pilot program with GRI community members, the ongoing collaborations on this topic with the ISSB, the TNFD, the Nature Positive Initiative, and our attendance at COP16. And we have a number of resources. The standard itself is translated into 10 languages, including Japanese. We have a training course on biodiversity disclosures, which you can access through the GRI Academy website. And we have interoperability mappings on biodiversity with both TNFD and the ESRS standard on that. That mapping is forthcoming, and the team are also working on developing case studies. And just a look now at GRI in the reporting landscape. The financial materiality side of reporting is really the space of the IFRS Foundation. On the financial reporting side, of course, there's the IASB and US GAAP through the FASB standards. On the disclosures on the sustainability-related financial disclosures, that's the risks and opportunities that lead to direct financial effects. That's the province of the ISSB and the SASB standards that they are developing. When it comes to reporting on the most significant impacts, the GRI is the key standard setter there. And these are separate standards with a separate approach, the multi-stakeholder approach, a completely different mandate from that which the IFRS Foundation has. The IFRS Foundation is not mandated to look at any user of reporting other than a narrow investor base. So that's where GRI and the GSSB has the expertise. The European standards sort of straddle both the sustainability-related financial disclosures and the impact disclosures. Their standards were co-created with Bastian's team at the GRI, and so the disclosures in the ESRS are very similar to those in GRI standards. And again, there's a detailed mapping document which shows where there are any differences. But basically very similar because our team helped develop those standards. So a great deal of overlap there. And any GRI reporter is really well positioned to report using ESRS. The ESRS, of course, use what they call a double materiality approach. And what they advise companies to do is to start by thinking about impacts. So most of their standards are concerned with impacts. Most of the content is about impacts coming from GRI standards. And they advise to start with that in determining the risks and opportunities for the financial side. And on that financial materiality side, they have worked with the ISSB. So we are talking with the ISSB about a global IFRS S plus GRI standards approach. We welcomed the launch of the ISSB standards, recognizing that reporting on risk to the organization is actually at a very low level. So anything that helps increase that, the SSBJ standards and the IFRS S standards is welcome and very important. And we're really acknowledging the significant work to increase reporting in that area. We have 2 MOUs with the ISSB now, one signed in 2022, an addendum signed in 2024 to have a collaboration whereby we try and align our work programs, reduce duplication in standards. And what we are really seeking to do is together to develop a global reporting system that covers the most significant impacts of an organization, its risks and opportunities that come from those impacts and dependencies, to make a sensible, comprehensive reporting system for organizations to use with minimal effort. And this is a timeline of that collaboration. So now there are meetings going on between the technical teams at the ISSB and GRI, and the board members themselves are meeting. So we've had 2 meetings now, a group of GSSB members with Emmanuel Faber and Richard Barker. We had an in-person meeting in London a couple of weeks ago. We'll have another online meeting in December, and more meetings planned for next year. So those meetings are going on between the standards board, the technical teams, and at some point between our supervisory board and the IFRS Foundation trustees, to make sure that we are all aligned in what we're doing and trying to make things as straightforward as possible for reporters. So the first piece of work we did with them was to issue guidance on the GHG, the greenhouse gas emissions, because, you know, many of the people now using the SSBJ standards or the IFRS S2 standard will have already been GRI reporters reporting greenhouse gas emissions under GRI reporting. And they were asking us in large numbers, well, what's the difference between this and the IFRS S requirements? How do we go from GRI to IFRS S? So we worked very closely with the IFRS S technical team and the board members to produce this guidance on exactly how to do that and where the difference lies. What we hope in future is that we won't need to do this kind of reconciliation, because we'll already be working together closely in developing the standards, so there won't be discrepancies between the sets of disclosures. The impact disclosures were already there from TCFD for the ISSB people to use. They are uncertain at this point what level of impacts they'll include in future standards, if any. The primary focus, of course, is on risks and opportunities and financial materiality. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Bastian, our Chief Standards Officer, to talk about the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. Thank you.
Thank you also from me for having us. I will continue the presentation and talk about the European sustainability reporting standards in a bit more detail, and importantly about the CSRD, the regulation that underpins this development. We look at the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and the ESRS as a game-changing event in the reporting landscape globally. And this is for the reasons that Carol has explained. Double materiality is going to become the norm, or two perspectives, maybe more importantly, in reporting will become the norm over time. This will happen at different pace in different jurisdictions, but it is now very clear that transparency and accountability eventually will be comprised of the very important perspective that has traditionally been established around financial risk and opportunity, in combination with a perspective that is looking at the impacts of business activity in its own right. And for that reason, a regulator acknowledging the work of 25 years of GRI and building on the impact perspective in corporate reporting, we've entered in a very close collaboration with the European regulator and the standard setter in the EU. And from 2021 onwards, we've worked with them to help build the European standards and make sure that the European standards build on the best practice that has been codified in the GRI standards. The reason for that is that we believe under a voluntary setting, using the GRI standards, the different stakeholder groups have come together to build best practice over consecutive years, and regulators have an opportunity to use this as the basis for their ambitions. And we indeed achieved in the first phase of work with the ESRS a high level of interoperability and commonality between the GRI standards on the one hand and the ESRS on the other hand. The collaboration goes as far that in the regulation in the EU, now the GRI standards are referenced as the go-to for topics that are currently not covered in the regulation. So if you extend your reporting to subjects that are not covered in the ESRS, you go to the GRI standards to look for the impact disclosure and to cover those topics. When you look at where we can make a difference for reporters and information users, we do believe that we have to support companies, and we want to achieve, as Carol has explained and Tomo, a global system for reporting that is driving one approach to corporate reporting on the global level for multinational companies while recognizing the needs of regulators locally. And to the extent possible, we will always try to work with regulators to represent as much as possible of the GRI contents. Here with the ESRS, we are now at a point that we can issue together with the European regulator and the standard setter guidance to reporters. And what you see is that when you have used the GRI standards in the past, whether that is as a European company falling under the regulation immediately, as a foreign company falling under the regulation through a subsidiary in the EU, you're very well positioned to cover the ESRS and to comply with the regulatory requirement in the EU. Where we will extend our work now into the future is that we continue to work on the second phase of the ESRS, which is focused on sector standards. And GRI, the Global Sustainability Standards Board, has looked very carefully to align its work program with regulatory activity. And our counterparts at the EU have also looked at what GRI can be providing to support their work. And we've ended up in a situation that very many of our projects on sector standards overlap at the moment. And we hope to produce in the next round of the ESRS an even higher alignment between the GRI standards disclosures and the ESRS as they will be codified over the next year. But our collaboration doesn't stop there. We're also working in the field of education and training, and we are collaborating on XBRL taxonomy to enable digital reporting. As part of the regulation in the EU, all companies that fall under the regulation will have to report digitally to the regulator. And GRI standards will use the same technology, XBRL, to digitize reporting, which eventually will help multinationals to respond to the European requirement, but also requirements in other jurisdictions. Carol has mentioned that we worked on resources for reporters, which we continuously develop. We have an interoperability index, and we have a draft of a mapping of all ESRS data points and disclosures vis-à-vis the GRI standards. So if you are in the situation that you have been using GRI, you're looking at the ESRS now, you can use these resources to identify the gaps that you have from your reporting today vis-à-vis the compliance exercise of applying the ESRS into the future. And we will continue to support this over the next years. When you look, when you look at the CSRD, the underpinning regulation that has brought about the ESRS, I think the most important thing for companies to know from a Japanese perspective is there is a high number of companies that are headquartered in the EU. The details are still politically discussed, but right now it's more than 40,000 companies that will have to report in the EU. The lion's share of these companies are companies that are primarily having business activities, and the main business activities in the EU have their headquarters in the EU. But also sizable subsidiaries of foreign companies will fall under the regulation. That will come in and be phased in over time. These are the two primary, I think, connection points for companies with the CSRD. But there is a third one which shouldn't be underestimated. As Carol and Tomo have explained, GI reporting and now the ESRS look at the impact of business activities on people, environment, and the economy. This is now a regulatory expectation in the EU, which gets handed down through the value chain to companies all around the globe. Expectations about transparency don't stop with headquarter level, don't stop with the closest circle of control, but they also look at suppliers. And for an export-focused country like Japan, and for very many of your largest companies and their suppliers, providing information about the topics covered in the CSRD will be part and parcel of the export relations that you have. You can see with the CSRD, and this is a resource that is available freely on our website, that there is a phasing in of different requirements over time. But there are two very important considerations. One is, if you have a sizable subsidiary already in the EU, you might be, at this point, already facing the requirement for next year to be reporting under the CSRD and the ESRS. You could also be in a situation where you will be able to face the full requirement also only towards the end of the 2020s and to 2029. But what is essential from a GI perspective, from an international operating perspective, is that you can use the GI standards to develop your reporting, and you can anticipate the trends in the EU, but also in other jurisdictions. As I said before, we do believe that other regulators in jurisdictions will follow suit and develop, maybe at different pace, but a broader perspective of corporate reporting. And by using the GI standards, you're well prepared for these developments. So our advice to companies now that will face requirements directly through the CSRD is to continue your GI reporting, because it positions you well for the requirement under the CSRD. But also, if you anticipate that your value chain partners will expect information provision from you, you will be able to supply this information if you have established the GRI reporting already. And then you will have to cover a gap towards the compliance exercise. But you're used to this already from very many other compliance exercises where local regulation requires an additional effort always. The CSRD and the ESRS are covering currently 12 subjects, and that's a fundamental difference with the GRI standards. We are covering more than 32 subjects, and so the GRI standards give you a much wider aperture, give you a much wider also context for sustainability performance. And by using the GRI standards in full, you can also anticipate regulation that will come in over time in different jurisdictions. We see currently a lot of interest in environmental subjects, but we do anticipate also for social subjects that other jurisdictions will look into establishing disclosure requirement. The regulation, of course, doesn't a reporting regulation doesn't come about in a vacuum. In the EU context, there is a whole host of regulations that directly connect to the reporting requirement. We, as a global standard setter, believe that we have to set standards that live one level above this. We will never be specific to local regulation. That is this is the raison d'etre of the local standard setting activity, and necessarily there will have to be a local focus. So you will find that GRI standards are oriented around international norms, international agreements, and arising best practice. And we leave the detail of the local interpretation and connection to local law to the national and jurisdictional standard setting. But the impacts that are felt through local regulation oftentimes stem from international norms. And one example in the EU context is the work around and the legal requirement around due diligence, which has a corresponding international norm, which has been adopted in the GRI standards. The European regulator has decided to set this through with a specific regulatory reference also locally. As I mentioned before, there are two main routes how you as a foreign company can be affected as a parent group by the CSRD. And depending on where you sit right now, you have different options to tackle this. I think the most important thing is there is a size requirement in terms of directly generated revenue in the EU above 150 million, which is actually the reality for many conglomerates, international conglomerates operating in the EU. This puts you on a trajectory where you can already start now to look at consolidating under the largest subsidiary locally. But you can also decide as a parent company to start using this ESRS. From 29 and 2030 onwards, there is a requirement that the subsidiaries have, all the subsidiaries have reporting in place. And so you can see it as a gradual phase in that scenario. And similarly, for those that have listed subsidiaries, there is an immediate requirement now already for those that are listed to report under the full ESRS or under the SME standard for small listed companies. I think this is a scenario that is a little less likely for the Japanese context because many of the subsidiaries are wholly owned by the parent company and not listed in the EU. But definitely also worthwhile to look at this where you have joint ventures and subsidiaries are co-owned. These were my remarks on the European standards, and I will continue with the standard setting activity of the GSSB and give an outline of where we are focusing our efforts right now. When it comes to the GSB priorities, I did mention already the reference points of international regulatory activity, but there is also an ongoing consultation of stakeholders in which we seek out market needs that inform the GSSB work program. And we work in a number of areas. We update the different categories of standards, topic standards, sector standards, as well as our universal standards. On an ongoing basis. We have a commitment to review each and every standard on a 3 to 4 year basis to ensure that the best practices are available to the reporters and stakeholders. We also provide implementation support. We did mention the resources together with the European standard setter, but more basic resources also are translations, 10 languages. We issue FAQs for each and every of our standards based on market needs and additional guidance material. Carol showed a couple examples for the biodiversity standard. There is work also in the background going on digital taxonomies, as I have explained. So when you look at the topic standards, this is where we have more than 30 standards in place. We have an ongoing review agenda. We've concluded the work on biodiversity. We're currently working on labor standards, and I will expand on this in a moment, as well as on climate change and energy-related standards. And we've started a project on economic impacts and pollution. So all in all, there are more than 20 standards under review at the moment. So a whole host of activity that will produce the best practice that is currently available on an ongoing basis. For the climate change and just transition related work, what I wanted to highlight today is maybe a response to a frequently asked question that GRI is receiving. So with the ISSB adopting the TSFD contents, setting out as to why is there a need to continue developing disclosure on climate change? And I think I want to explain a bit more where impact perspective and risk and opportunity perspective connect, but also the role of GRI as a blueprint of reporting into the future and more ambitious reporting on impact into the future. So we've started the work in 2023 and have developed since then a fully fledged standard both on climate change and just transition, as well as energy, which will be released next year. We're in the final stages on a similar timeline as the colleagues here in Japan with their standards, with a release towards the end of the first quarter next year. And the scope of the project is the review of the existing standards, but also taking in new content as it has emerged. And we're never operating in a vacuum. We are always operating with the players around that. And that importantly includes for climate change, the work of the IFRS, ISSB, as well as the work of EFRAG, where we look to align disclosure requirement where possible. But we also work with the related institutions, both in terms of the ranking and rating and benchmarking, as well as the normative and methodology type developments around us. The UN framework, the science-based targets are some of the reference points for this particular standard. When it comes to the key features of this standard, what it will do over and above climate reporting as it is manifested in the ISSB's work, is we focus on the social impact of climate change and we focus on the just transition disclosure. We look at much more detailed reporting on the reduction targets and progress over time. We also look at climate change transition and adaptation plans vis-a-vis also the Paris scenario. And we have inserted a lot more detailed disclosure on carbon credits, which can, and removals, which can be a critical aspect of reporting if they're done well. And when you see now the differences between our existing standard and what we will be issuing next year, you see these contents coming back. So the renewed and more detailed focus on qualitative disclosure in adaptation and just transition. We've aligned the disclosure with the GRI protocol and the work of the ISB for the actual emissions. And then we're looking at carbon credits and removals with a lot more detail. I did mention the work that we do on labor standards. I think in this particular context here, it is a critically important subject with the competition for talent and employee well-being at the forefront of initiatives. We develop contents in 3 phases. We work on employment practice and conditions, and we've issued standards for public consultation already. The public consultation has just closed. We are now in the next phase developing standards on working life and career development, training and education, diversity and inclusion are examples of this. And in the 3rd phase, we will develop contents on worker rights and protection. And what you see really well here is how we declinate through both normative elements as well as corporate best practice elements in our standard setting activity. So when it comes to representation, also here we have an international group of experts, importantly with a committee that brings together the tripartite institutions under the ILO, the International Labour Organization, the International Organization of Employers, and the International Trade Union Confederation and the Global Unions Federation. They lead the work, and they're complemented by an advisory group that also has a Japanese member, Sachiko Ishikawa, from the law firm Tanabe and Partners. And they are advising the technical committee on the practicalities of reporting that we're developing. When you look at the timeline, we will be issuing a next set of standards for public consultation in the 1st quarter of next year and hope to finalize the full set of labor-related disclosures so that it is available for corporates by 2026. For our sector-related activity, we've started working on this in 2019, and we've developed sector standards for oil and gas, coal, agriculture, aquaculture, and fishing. And we're currently working, as well as mining, we're currently working on banking, capital markets, and insurance, and textile and apparel. And we've created priority groups through business activities. Eventually, we will be covering 40 sectors. This approach is very much aligned with the regulatory initiative that we've seen that has sector references, adopting the UN approach to business activity and sector specification. So currently ongoing is the work, as I said, on the banking, capital markets, and insurance. And we have public exposure of these contents by the 2nd quarter of next year. For textile and apparel, we are on a similar timeline. The public exposure will happen slightly later, but also in the 2nd quarter. And for the project that we have on the financial services sector, this is a sector, of course, also of crucial relevance in this country. We're breaking it into 3 elements. The banking sector, which includes retail and commercial banking, lending, investment banking, and payment providers. Capital markets, which include asset managers, owners, including pension funds and sovereign wealth funds. And insurance, life insurances, non-life insurances, and reinsurance businesses, as well as insurance intermediaries. In that work, we have built 3 groups that are developing these contents. And as I said, the next point that also offers an opportunity for you to engage with the contents will be next year in the 2nd quarter. Here you can see the different constituencies as they're represented in the work that we're doing at the moment. We do believe that we've captured a very global perspective on this, but also acknowledge that through public consultation, we will have to hear out stakeholder voice from different regions, including from Japan. In terms of additional work that we do beyond topic standards and sector standards work at the moment, we're doing research into future themes. We've discussed with the GSSB this year the need for reporting for the public sector, and the first discussion paper has been in front of the GSSB. We're also looking to future topic standards, and we've discussed the topic of digitization, data protection, and privacy. We're also exploring at the moment international humanitarian law and operating in conflict regions as one of the topics. And last but not least, I did mention the digital taxonomy already, but building on the work that we've done to develop GRI, we are now, to Carol's explanation, also exploring how risks and opportunities relate to impacts, and we will issue additional guidance. We've started this in discussions with the GSB and are now moving to a decision point to announce a project. In terms of capacity building and support that GRI can provide, we have a number of activities ongoing there. So we offer services where you can look at getting feedback from GRI directly on your content indexes, but also the linkages with the SDGs, and now more recently with the ESRS. We license software partners. Most of the global operating software entities that offer reporting software have licensed their software with GRI. That means you have access to the GRI standards through these software packages. We have a strong educational offering, and we have a local partner here with the IDCGA that has been training locally in person as well as online, and that is combined with a GRI Academy where we offer training also online to global audiences. All with the ambition to have a professional certification. You can take an exam and can become certified in GRI reporting. Another opportunity to engage with GRI is through our community. You can join the community and work with leading companies globally on the implementation of new standards and be very close to the development of the standards as it happens. I thought one more thing that could be of interest also due to the highlighted attention for the ESRS. GRI is offering support for ESRS reporting both through a service as well as through the certification program. We have a fully fledged curriculum for the ESRS, and you can take training courses on the ESRS, moving you to a proficient level on understanding of the ESRS, including the relationship with GRI reporting. I did mention the GRI Academy with its offering, and it is possible to take local training in the Japanese language here with our partners, as the IDCJ as well as BSI. And you can then come back to GRI for the exam and take the exam and feature this certification in your professional credentials. I did mention also the reporting services. I think what could be of interest in your particular context, if you have been using the GRI standards, is help from GRI to identify the gap between your reporting now and the ESRS. We're offering a service for this, so we will look with you at your report and identify what more you need to do to comply with the European regulation if that is relevant in your context. I close my remarks here. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A in a moment.